seeing my fresh knuckle tattoos. Boo and hiss. It's a sort of a testament to no longer doing stand-up comedy, but now also the hiss hand is the snake hand and the boo
No
hand is the
kidding.
ghost hand.
Is
So
the snake new too?
I got the snake. I got the snake earlier this year, but it's a copperhead snake, obviously, inspired by my experience in the woods.
This is Dash Kwiatkowski telling me about their new tattoos. We sat down together to speak about a paranormal show that Dash is the lead on. It's called Liminal. I watched the first episode of Liminal and it blew my mind. So I reached out to Dash and asked if they would be a guest on my show, Paranormal Matters. Dash and I had a great conversation and talked about so many different things, from the role of transgender folks in the paranormal community, the legend of the Bell Witch in Tennessee, the state of paranormal investigation, and we talk about synchronicities. I highly recommend you all check out Dash's show, Liminal. I have a link to episode 1 in the description.
I'm joined on Paranormal Matters with a child of flowers from the sky. Welcome, Dash
Thank you.
Kwiatkowski.
Thank you. Yeah, great. So it is the Child of Flowers part that is Kwiatkowski. It is Polish and it does mean Child of Flowers. And then so the full name is Dashel. No one calls me that unless they're mad at me. The full name is Dashel, and so that is Day Ciel, and Ciel is the of the sky, which yeah, it's a very fun set of things to be called. I will say I think the thing that a lot of times, because as a trans person, a lot of my friends have cool and weird and interesting names that they've chosen themselves, and I didn't choose this one. That's sort of one of the things about me that a lot of people assume that Dash is a name that I selected for myself. And in fact, my parents had to get at least one thing right. They got one thing right, and it was the name. They did call a non-binary shot on accident, giving me a cool trans name before any of us knew what was going on.
Well, that's great. And the translations that you gave before we started from both the Polish and the French, "Child of Flowers from the Sky," I was like, that's it. That's how you're being introduced. Because I thought it would have difficulty with Kwiatkowski. And did I do okay?
You did totally fine. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I was saying before we started, I spent over a decade touring, doing stand-up comedy, and many attempts have been made, and many of them have been 1 million times worse than I think anything the vast majority of people can do. So do not sweat it. Yeah, I think we're doing great.
All right. Well, I have to say I think a few weeks ago, a friend of mine on Facebook, Stephanie Quick, posted a link and tagged me, and it was, I could just see the thumbnail to this new show called Liminal, episode 1. And I was like, oh, okay, Liminal. I like liminal things. I'm right up there. And then I saw the title, Bell Witch, and I was like, oh, I'm there as well. I'm going to watch an episode on the Bell Witch, and I'd like to see where this goes. But then I watched, I would say, the first 3 or 4 minutes of the episode, and I had to stop it and literally stop it, and then just clear my head, go for a walk, because everything that you were saying there was were things that I needed to hear. And I think that people who have an interest in the paranormal also need to hear, because there is this depth in this great dimension of liminality
Yeah.
that you were able to succinctly discuss in, I would say, a minute, in which I would spend 3 hours even working up to what you shared. So I'm just going to play that
That's
clip.
very, very kind. Of course. Yeah. I appreciate hearing that very much. There's an understanding in the paranormal that hauntings or magic or anything that we would call high strangeness is drawn to liminal spaces like hotels and prisons and schools and train stations. And it got me thinking about how the paranormal might interact with or be drawn to liminal identities. I'm a non-binary trans person. I'm a mixed race person. My entire identity is in many ways permanently liminal. And when you start looking at pre-colonial societies from all around the world, people who, while you can't call them trans because that's anachronistic, but people who existed outside of the Western idea of a gender binary were not only accepted and welcomed in so many of these societies, they were seen as mystical and magical. We were shamans and spiritual advisors, seen as occupying this real world and also a spiritual paranormal world based on our liminal identities. I think that this is our space. I think that in the same way that we are drawn to this thing, and sure, you can say it comes from a place of kinship, of being othered, of being seen as on the margins or seen as villainous in the same way that these creatures are, but I think it goes beyond that. I think there's something intrinsic to this identity that calls out to the strange, and I think the strange calls back out to us. So my goal here is to find people like me who feel drawn to something that is bigger and weirder. And then with the help of those people, I want to find that bigger, weirder thing. And I love that. I love that music break. I will say that's one of my favorite. Will at Strangebird, who edited this episode, edited our pilot, and also did all the scoring. He's the person we're working with. He's shooting our episodes moving forward. He shot our bonus episode with Ray Wise. And again, similarly did the score, did everything. But I love what he's done with the music. It brings me a lot of joy to hear just like oh, it sounds cool too. Like we got a cool sounding show.
My friend, it was not just the sounds, it was the video treat as well. There was a lot going on that you don't find in a university lecture hall.
True.
Although I think a university lecture hall, these things should also be shared, right?
I love that.
Yeah. So when I first saw that, I stopped it. And I think I texted Stephanie or something. I said, "Who is this person, and can they be my friend?"
Happy to be your friend. I love making friends with weird interests. That's one of my favorite.
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
one of the coolest things about paranormal investigating so far is like I'm just meeting very cool people.
Yeah. So, well, there's a lot that I want to actually discuss with you, and there's going to be links to this to your episode,
Totally.
episode 1. But I'm curious if we can go back to this idea of liminality. And it, in my mind, it really speaks to the binaries, right? So male, female, good, evil, human, animal, intelligence, non-intelligence, physical, immaterial.
The one that I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm currently in the process of I just finished writing, and I'll be recording a presentation for Anomicon to Ryan. I don't know if it's Sprague or Sprague. I truly don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he invited me to be part of a virtual paranormal convention. And so I'm working on this presentation, sort of digging deeper, because one of the things about the show, I love that I have the opportunity to talk about this sort of gender and sort of the history of gender. but I didn't get to dig as deep as much as I want to be like, these are the sources. Here's the Leslie Feinberg text I'm trying to get people to read. Here's all the things. And so for this presentation, I've been digging into it. And in the process that I've just been thinking about one binary that I'm really fixated on right now is real and not real. And that one is like really, really sitting with me in terms of like, how comfortable are we existing in this space? You know, like if you ask me, do I 100% believe ghosts exist even? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. But I am like, I'm going out in the woods. I'm going trying to talk to them. And it's this really strange space of like, what does it mean to exist? If we're talking about tulpas and egregores and things that sort of we fill in with our own minds or we fill in with the power of thought, like this idea of the liminal space between real and not real is I'm really fixated on in this moment.
Oh, absolutely. And you mentioned the word belief, which was also interesting because that's also a binary, belief and disbelief, right? So fact and fiction, belief, disbelief. And I've been giving that, what you were just speaking about, some thought as well, and we can get into that a bit. But I was thinking about, when you were sharing that, a quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, who's one of my all-time favorite authors, and she passed away in 2018. And I was listening to a eulogy on the CBC radio up here in Canada, and she had said one time, and I can't remember where she said it. She said, there is a lot about nature that we don't understand, but to call them ghosts ensures we won't understand. The best we can do is to not give them labels, but to be quiet and listen.
I love that. Yeah, that's really spectacular.
Right. And so when you were sharing that, I think that's also what I got from your experience in both in the theater space, which I would love to talk about,
absolutely,
and in the woods of Robertson County, Tennessee, where the one thing you didn't do at the end, and I was really happy you didn't do this, because every time I watch a paranormal investigation,
right,
here are the findings, this is what we have. Whereas what you do in your episode is, here is a box, or perhaps here is a jar.
A jar,
and
maybe,
we are not going to open the jar up and release the magic, because there's something in there, but it's up for everyone to explore this if they so choose.
Part of that for me is, I never, it's multifaceted. On one hand, I think that a lot of people, regardless of sort of the area they are in high strangeness, whether it is UFOs or ghosts or cryptids or sort of wherever people want to be, I think that people, I forget, someone was talking about this and I forget who it was. They were talking about how people are very desperate to show that they are not wasting their time. And I think people are very, very desperate to be like, I'm doing science. Like, I am doing science. I'm doing hard science. I'm not just out in the woods having fun, seeing what happens. I am measuring things, and I'm taking measurements, and I'm doing all these things. And, I've said this a couple of times now, but like, if I wanted to do science, I would go do science. There's so much science to be done that's fascinating. Mushrooms. We know so little about mushrooms. I love mushrooms. I love foraging. We know, I want to say it's something like 3% of mushrooms on the planet is the estimate of what we as humans know about mushrooms. There is hard science to be done. This is not the thing I want to spend my life doing. I am trying to have a weird, unexplainable, and I think by definition unknowable experience. And I that doesn't make it any less valid to me. That doesn't make it any less legitimate. In fact, that makes it more interesting to me, because like, we're exploring something that someone could very easily say, all of that was coincidence. Nothing actually happened. You experienced a lot of coincidences. And my response is, yeah, maybe. maybe it felt really magical to me. What we documented felt pretty magical as well. But if someone really wants to sort of dig their heels in and say, nope, just coincidences, totally. I'm not going to fight you on that because this is my experience and I'm doing my best to document it. And I think that feels more earnest to me as we sort of, one thing I've talked about a lot with Will from Strangebird, who we're shooting with now, is that I if the binary here is reality TV versus documentary, I'm always want to land on the documentary side because that just feels much more interesting. And this is not a slam on other ghost. It's a little bit of a slam on other ghost. I like a sensationalist ghost show. It's fun. They bring out the rainbow laser grid and they never tell you what it does. Nobody ever explains what that piece of technology does. I'm going to be real. I don't know. I don't know what that does. They bring it out on every show. Here's our fog machine and our laser grid. And they're like, look, ghosts. And you're like, I guess. Yeah, sure. I'll try it. If someone wants to supply Liminal with the rainbow laser grid, we will give it a college try. I don't know what it does. But I feel like there's this urge to prove we are doing science. We're not wasting our time. And I think that as a person who I like going out, nothing feels like a waste of time to me. I think there's definitely a scary moment every time we travel to do paranormal stuff because I am very opposed to like staging anything. I'm very opposed to staging anything. There's a moment every time we're traveling where I'll look at either Rosa or I'll look at Jules and I'll be like, I hope something spooky happens. Like I hope it gets weird because if it's not, we're gonna get a lot of footage and nothing. But I understand it. I like it. I like a sort of a spooky sensationalist show too because it's funny. It's fun. It's a fun time usually. But that is not the thing we're trying to make. And I'm trying to be more comfortable with the idea of like, I think I say on the show, like, I'm not trying to be like, we got footage of Bigfoot because I am not convinced that you can, you know?
Yeah, at best you would get blob squatch, right? It's
Right.
just I think what you are describing speaks to me to a lot of the frustration that folks in the UFO community and cryptid community they're seeking for material truths when perhaps what they're doing is not science so much as it is the ineffable. So like what my experience watching the show was not getting an encyclopedic entry on the Bell Witch.
Right.
It was, we are in this liminal place in American history.
Yeah.
And it is, for me, it's ground zero for American history liminality, where every single binary gets thrown out to the best of my knowledge. So I do want to speak a bit about the Bell Witch in a few minutes, but I want to go back to the comment that you were talking about in the video clip that we showed, and that is the role of trans people historically, again, using today's terminology,
totally,
as people who occupy these very special zones within their communities. Can you add some dimension to that for us?
Yeah, and in fact, this is kind of a sort of a cool one for me as I've been researching that presentation and writing it. I did some, so I sort of you'll see that I try not to talk about specific cultures that are not my own because I think that it would be very easy to be like, here's this culture and they had people and this is my proof, and that feels very disrespectful to me. And I did find, so I'm Korean. I'm a Korean, mixed race Korean person, and I have done a decent amount of research into just like Korean spiritual practice because I'm interested. And I grew up, I was not really allowed to be Korean growing up. A lot of my connection to the culture as an adult, I have like learned to cook the food and learned, I'm trying to learn the language. I'm doing a bad job. I'm trying to learn the language. But prior to Confucianism being introduced, prior to Taoism, prior to Buddhism, any of those things being introduced, there was a spiritual practice, and it still exists. There are still practitioners of this called Mu. And so the practitioner of the Mu is called the Mudang. And this is the female role in society, in Korean society. It's a shamanistic role. You have to be sort of selected by higher powers. You go through like a sickness that is like potentially fatal. And then if you survive it, if you survive this like spirit sickness, you are taken in and taught by another Mudang, and it's sort of initiated into this thing. And as I was researching this, I found someone writing about the Baksu Mudang, which were Mudang who were male, or at least assigned male, or existed, or were assigned male, I'll say, who would still put on all of the female outfit and all of the female sort of artifice and do the ritual as if female. And so there is not enough historical evidence to say whether or not these Baksu Mudang lived as men for their whole lives or lived as women. Maybe a little of column A, a little of column B, who knows? But at the very least, for the magical practice, for the practice of this, the shamanistic practice of Mu, Baksu Mudang would present as female and sort of occupy this female role. And so I feel very comfortable talking about that as a Korean person, to be like, actually, even in my own people's history, this is there. And so I think that I the more that I look into it, the more I discover this, where there is this idea of the material and the immaterial, this idea of even binary gender, people who are either existing as another option, as an expansive gender identity, or going from one to the other, sort of taking that journey across in presentation or existence. That it strikes me that a large number of cultures, and I say pre-colonial in the show, but even some colonial, even in Leslie Feinberg's book Transgender Warriors, which is a wonderful read. I think most people know Feinberg for Stone Butch Blues, but Transgender Warriors is a really, really spectacular book. I recommend it to as many people as I can. But Feinberg talks about even Joan of Arc, Joan of Arc sitting under a fairy tree, being told by voices that the thing to do would be to exist and sort of exist with a presentation outside of what society said gender roles could be. And, Joan of Arc was, obviously there mixed reaction at the time, but was also like a very successful cultural figure, sort of through that magical sort of interference in that magical practice. And so like, even in colonial societies, there have been, historically speaking, so many places where expansive gender identity was connected to magic. And to me, as I was thinking about it, I was just like, it feels like too much for that to just be a coincidence. And again, this goes to the thing we were saying before. Someone could say that's a coincidence, don't worry about it. Like, to them I say maybe, yeah, totally. But for me, like my felt experience, it just feels very relevant, and it feels very like, every time I learn, learning about the Korean one was very meaningful to me, obviously, as a Korean person, where this is sort of my whole thing, to be like, wow, it's wild that I didn't know this. Yeah, it just feels like, sort of historically and consistently, a great many of people have said, like, there is magic to an expansive take on gender.
Yet we we also have to acknowledge how difficult it is today.
Certainly.
Right? Like, and that's
certainly,
like, I'm sure sometimes just walking out the door.
Yeah.
So I deeply appreciate magic when it's brought into the discussion.
Yeah.
I just, my own personal thought, I think that when we get so stratified
Yeah.
in binaries, it's the binaries themselves that become the zone where trouble occurs.
Yeah.
Right? Because
Certainly.
there's no porous nature on who we are as human beings, because we're just rigidly fixed in
Yeah.
these ideas. Whereas, no, if you actually consider there is a whole zone of wonder
Yeah.
between. Now, mind you, and I think this is one of the subtexts to what you're saying, is within particular cultural systems,
Yeah.
there are protocols that allow
Certainly.
for that space to be traveled.
Yeah.
Uh, and like, how to even have that discussion with people who are so rigidly stuck in that binary? It's impossible, but we can at least open it with magic, right?
And I think sort of this is one of the things that I think that it's interesting because this goes in the one direction, right? Of like, how do you show someone that like we are just people? You know, how do you show someone that like there is no, trans agenda? I mean, the trans agenda is to grow old and exist, which I think is a fair agenda to have. But it's interesting because I think on the other hand as well, there is this idea of what sorry, what I was saying is how do you show someone? I think a lot of that is just humanity, is that meeting people. I think one of the easiest ways to sort of show someone that any marginalized group is not out to get them is to introduce that person to members of that marginalized group, and to say like, hey, these are just people trying to exist. And I think what's very interesting to me as I approach this show, I've said a lot that the thesis of this show is this idea of queerness and transness and its connection to the magic intrinsically. The secret thesis of the show, which is also there, is I am from San Francisco. I'm from the West Coast. I grew up in a there is no place where it is easy to be not white in this country. There's no place where it's easy to sort of be visibly queer in this country. But I think San Francisco is one of the cities that it's like, hey, this is a gay city, and like this is idea of like of whatever. But I was really told culturally that the South is a certain way. The American South is a certain way, and everyone there is out to get you, and it's this hostile, dangerous place. And I think once I started going there and visiting and spending time, and I was like, oh, like I'm going on these tours where I'm spending weeks at a time in Tennessee and I'm performing at historic drag bars and I'm meeting cool, weird, spectacular queer people and people of color and just like everything that I was sort of told, like, this is not welcome here. This, when you go over there, it's going to be dangerous. And, I'm at no point would I ever say like it is safe to be queer or trans anywhere, but I've been called slurs just about ever. I've been called slurs on the coast. I've been called slurs in New York City. I've been called slurs basically anywhere. And I think that the secret thesis is just to let people, I think, who haven't spent a lot of time in the South know that like, hey, this is like, it's just people here. It's just people, and there's cruelty and there's bigotry everywhere. And a lot of the places that vote solid red, they vote that way because they've been gerrymandered to vote that way to ensure that they keep voting solid red. And it's not because there's anything intrinsic about like, oh, there's worse people. There's bad people everywhere. There's good people everywhere. And so I think it's a similar thing. And I hadn't really put this together until just now talking to you, but it's very interesting to me that my secret thesis of I would like to show people on the coast that like there's some really incredible, fascinating people in the South is the same idea of I want to show people that there's like trans people are just people too. And it's funny how those two are like sort of very, very similar. What am I trying to do with my show that I'm making is just demonstrate humanity, I guess, in a show about magic and cryptids and stuff. And I hadn't really put together those were the same thing. So thank you. That's a fun thing to realize.
Well, I think at its heart, uh, magic and relationships
Yeah,
are deeply fundamentally connected.
yeah,
And where we have those fears, and I'll just say, as a Canadian, we are like, it's like genetically bred into our culture to be afraid of Americans. Uh,
totally. Hey, I get it. Listen. Hey, listen, I get it. Sure.
but but it's the relationship building where the magic
Yeah.
is, because you're always, I think, in my mind at least, with when you're in a relationship with anybody that you meet,
Yeah.
there's always that moment of discovery, and there's always that moment just before discovery when you get to know something new about them. And
Yeah.
to me, that is the essence of magic. And I could be naive, but I think that's where that well, like that's that
Yeah.
deep well, is discovery and the moment before discovery. And you find that in others.
Yeah.
You,
Absolutely.
and you find it in nature too, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, how about we talk about Tennessee a bit?
Let's
And
do it.
yeah, so let's talk about Robertson County in particular. And
Yeah.
actually, can I just share with you the most
Please.
frightening book? The most
Okay.
frightening book I ever read is Martin Van Buren Ingram's what was it? A true account of the Bell Witch. I'll have
Yeah.
the correct title, but it's the most frightening book
Yeah.
M.V. Ingram. He
Yeah.
was a descendant of the Bell family. And I read that
Yeah.
book, and I was like alone in the woods reading that book. And I was like, holy shit, I don't know
not
if I
the
want to
not
read
the
this.
not the best place to read it, I would say, all things considered.
So tell us about the Bell Witch and what drew you to that story.
So I think I really like, at first I was just like, what are some American ghost stories? What are some, like, as I'm thinking about the sort of post colonial Turtle Island stories that are like, what are, like, really sort of establish, if we're for our pilot episode, I want to start sort of in the past. I want to go into, like, something that feels sort of foundational to strangeness and horror in this sort of country. And so I was looking into stories. I was with a focus on the South. And when I got into the story, a lot of things that I noticed that felt very interesting to me were, the presentation of Kate Batts as, like, a big, strong woman who did all the work, and we're supposed to not like that. We're supposed to laugh when she sits on a bunch of people and they pass out. We're supposed to laugh at her size and her strength and all these things. And all of that is gender roles, right? All of that is in sort of the roles assigned to us, how we are supposed to act. And I think Ingram even fills out that, like, oh yeah, her husband was sick, so she had to do all this stuff. But that doesn't stop the narrative from being like, and then look, isn't it funny that she's big and she sat on some people? And it's like, I guess, yeah, sure. That's where we're going with this. That's where we're going with this thing. And so thinking about that, um thinking about the idea of a little girl and sort of like what society expects of her and how she is treated and how's, so much of her life, like, even the sort of like a Belle is never supposed to marry a gardener, puts a lot of societal pressure on a little girl when she's 12 or something. She's too young. Certainly she's not thinking about who she's going to marry at that age, right? And so I was thinking about, like, gender roles and rigid gender roles and sort of rigid roles in general. I was thinking about the sort of the wrapping of war criminal Andrew Jackson in the narrative, and like how it is that is used for legitimacy of, like, oh, Andrew Jackson named it the Bell Witch. And I'm like, okay, for sure. Like, I mean, that guy sucks, but if that's great, okay, cool. And so I think that there were a lot of things sort of hovering around the story that felt very much like there's meat here. There's, like, something to explore here. And if I'm being completely honest as well, I was like, let me check out, like, what have other ghost shows done with this story, with this lore? And a lot of it was just generic, like, this is a ghost, this is a haunting, this would happen, we're gonna this is scary, and we're gonna try to summon it or whatever. And then all felt very surface level, and it didn't feel like anyone had really sort of gone into it in the direction that I wanted to. I found out later that my friend Bex, who works with the cool people of Liminal Earth, which was another fun little synchronicity to be like, I had this, like, thing, and I was building it, we're putting all this stuff together, and then I found out about Liminal Earth. I don't know if you're familiar with the Liminal Earth folks. Really cool group of people. They are based mainly out of the Pacific Northwest out here, but Liminal Earth is a sort of a user filled map of just the Earth, and people can report strange, like high strange encounters that they have, and they just plug them in, and so you can go on this map and sort of like see like what are weird things people have experienced near me, what's the closest like UFO or cryptid or whatever sighting. So it's a really cool, just like really cool project made by some really cool. And I ended up being like buddies with these people. And I was like, this is so funny. I even messaged them. I was like, hey, this is so funny. I've been working on this thing. I've been shooting this thing. We both have liminal in the name. I hope that's cool. And they're like, yeah, of course it's cool. And I was like, okay, for sure, for sure. But Bex is like a really, really like has been fixated on the Bell Witch and sort of like trying to get at it, and from a perspective that is not not the same perspective everyone has done of just like John Bell, good poor guy, got attacked by this thing, and it's like for sure the man did enslave people, but okay, yeah, totally. Like I have some issue with how everything is presented in terms of the story. I've gone so roundabout. The Bell Witch, John Bell and his son see a weird animal that's like a mixture of a dog and a rabbit, and they shoot at it with their guns. That's their first interaction, and from there, a haunting starts happening, and it is truly written in very classic horror style, and like all of this stuff. From there, they start to hear what sounds like a mouth being formed. That part really stuck with me. The almost like the Cronenberg body horror of like something growing teeth and growing a mouth and like all the
Oh
noises
man,
it makes.
I can't even
Yeah.
tell you that is in that scene in particular in the book where it starts just as a barely audible whisper and
Yeah.
as if it's this unseen presence that is growing only in voice in front of
Yeah.
multiple people. So
Yeah.
it's yeah, I get you.
Well, and then even like, and a thing that I've been thinking about a lot too, as I've been talking about this, is just like we're presented. I think we get this first glance at sort of some of the sort of the structure in the story in terms of how it's told, where we're given this other version of like, oh, the kids were playing around in a mound and they found a skull and they brought it in, and in the context of then you would hear that and be like, oh yeah, they found the skull. And now I'm like, those kids were desecrating a grave. Those kids were desecrating the remains of an indigenous person, and then it's like, but it's painted as like, and that's the spooky scary thing. And to me, just sort of thinking about it, and people still will sort of just talk about that part without acknowledging that like we're talking about grave desecration. And I think that's I think a really fascinating thing to me, how all of the things that are sort of normalized in storytelling. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've talked about this a couple of times, but I think that, and this is sort of one of the things that I've sort of, as I think about the Bell Witch, and I think about how American fiction deals with haunting, the concept of haunting, and why it is structured the way that it's structured. And a lot of it to me, I think, involves and stop me if you see where I'm going, but this idea that if you are the current resident of a place, no matter what horrible things have happened there, to allow you to be the current resident of that place, as long as you're good, sweet people, don't worry about it. And in fact, anything that is a reverberation of that, whatever happened in the past, you're still the victim as long as you yourself have your hands clean, whatever. And I think that so much of American ghost stories and ghost media is built around this idea. Like even like Poltergeist, like the movie Poltergeist, sweet nice white family moves into a spot, they're not responsible for anything that happened. It's just all of the reasons that they're allowed to live there. But it's framed in this very like, don't feel guilty, don't feel bad, don't think about everything, do not think about the blood that is like baked into the soil you're standing on. And I think that that's really fascinating in terms of the Bell Witch, because I feel like the Bell Witch it was a very early ghost story. So I don't think that all of those sort of tropes had been sort of like cemented yet. And in fact, I think that those tropes were sort of still being cemented and still sort of built up. And I think for all of these reasons, the Bell Witch to me just felt like a really like interesting and resonant story to start this show, to start sort of this show on. I just feel like there is so much in terms of who's telling the story, how does gender function and fit into the story, and sort of how do we maybe try to go at it in a different direction than anyone has yet in sort of in the genre. And so it just really felt like, I think all of that is sort of what really drew me to the story, is like this is where we want to start with this.
Wow. So William Roll, a Danish parapsychologist, in his book Poltergeist, offers the definition of haunting by walking through the early English etymology of the word, which its nearest neighbor is homing.
Okay.
So an understanding of home. And so he has a limited definition there where he
Interesting.
says you see an apparition which might be a previous owner returning home. But just what I'm gathering from what you're
Interesting.
saying is that this also has some dimension for the current people who are living there. And perhaps
Yeah.
we're missing that completely because
Yeah.
they have a definite role in what's
Yeah.
happening. But the one thing that Ingram does, and it happens in a case that I'm working through writing a book about the Baldoon mystery, is
Yeah.
everybody is presented as being so squeaky clean, nice.
Yep. Yep.
They're
Exactly.
good, upstanding citizens.
Yep.
And in our present day, we can't say yes or no, but at the
Yeah.
same time, we can say, well, come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I'm
Hmm.
sure there were some gray areas at least.
At the very least, some gray areas, I there's a lot to be said about John Bell, even in terms of the sort of like the this is very, I almost said the sort of the meow meowification, meow meow being our, like, it's a, people talk about like my special meow meow is just like this guy who's done nothing wrong. You see this, people do this about like celebrities or whatever. um but even the sort of the victimization of John Bell as it is presented, as this man was murdered by this spectral being. He was poisoned by the Bell Witch, and that's why he died when he was 70 years old, which the life expectancy back then, like 70 feels like a pretty good far and long way to make it at that time period. And so this idea of like, nope, ghost got him, to me is like, okay, really? That's a little bit wild to me, but we have to sort of, it almost to me strikes me as this, like, we have to villainize, like there has to be this ultimate like villain victim. There has to be like the evil spiritual entity and the poor sweet man who was killed. When all the things that I know about John Bell, it doesn't seem like, you know he was quite so innocent in terms of how he was existing and taking up space. I mean, even the Kate Batts thing, like when you get into the story, is if my memory is correct, he kind of screwed Kate Batts over in a financial deal, and I think was even required by the church to pay some of the money back. Like I think they even told him like, no, you got to pay some money back. So
Yes,
like,
and I think some of these portions in the church records may have been like blacked out
yeah,
afterwards. Is
yeah.
something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, and so I just think that it's sort of, that's, I think, the other thing that I like about it is this is like it feels like a very clear, like, who is telling this story. And when it feels very obvious in the Bell Witch story. But I think that analysis is really important for every story that we look into, for every time that we start thinking about the paranormal, for every time we start thinking about, I watched a really interesting YouTube video that I would recommend about, somebody was debunking a lot of American Bigfoot people will be like, well, did you know that the indigenous people here had, 300 different Bigfoot myths? And this person made this YouTube video where they were like, I want to know how true that is. And so they go into it and they look up this list, and like some of the things that are being cited as evidence are like, one is like a snake with big feet, and it's literally a snake that has feet. And it's like, I don't think that we should be able to count that as a indigenous Bigfoot. That is a snake that has feet. And just to put a lot of
Also
the
known as a lizard.
well. Now hold on a sec, because I think it just has the 2 feet, so it is a bipedal. It is a bipedal
Oh, okay.
snake. but also, hey, some snake have feet and they're in the skeleton and they're, that said, very, but it was sort of, it's interesting looking at how people will utilize things to prove a point. And I think, and this sort of goes towards the thing that I was saying about not wanting to just point to other cultures and be like, look, they had trans people and that proves my point, because that feels very sort of, it just feels utilitarian in a way that I'm not trying to be. And so when I think about like who's writing stuff down, who was interviewed, that's a really cool thing. The Bigfoot video, I'll send it to you if you want to put it in the notes. It's just a fascinating video. But this person who made this like reached out to some of the indigenous nations and was like, hey, it seems like this person talked to someone. And a lot of times they would get responses back like, oh yeah, this person came and was very disrespectful, and like we actually didn't have a good time talking, and we're kind of pissed off about this book. And so like I think that it's very interesting, like how we in our sort of, in an effort to make points, in an effort to have something to say, I think we will cite to things, and we will cite to stories, and we will cite to people. And it's very important to me to sort of be conscious about what that means, and be conscious about what that citation is, who is being cited to, what I'm trying to do by citing to someone or something. And so, I think that the Bell Witch story, specifically the way that Ingram tells the story, just feels it is so biased in such very specific ways that I was just like, this feels like a very, I don't know, it just is so interesting to dig into.
I would say that Ingram was a definite wordsmith, a
Yeah,
storyteller.
certainly, certainly.
And on that note that you were just talking about, the voice and the absolute silence of the African American slaves that lived
Yeah,
on the plantation or whatever it was that
yeah.
Bell owned on the farm.
Hmm.
They are rarely mentioned, and if they are, it's
Yep.
at their horrible treatment from Kate,
Yeah,
right? So it's like
yeah,
I'm reading this, and they're being horrifically victimized
yeah,
whenever they're mentioned.
yeah,
So there's that too, and
yeah,
that's a part of that voice that
yeah,
seeks to either. One of the ways I think of it is there was a map theorist or cartographic theorist, J.B. Harley, who wrote the silent spaces on maps are the ones that you should actually be looking at. There's no
yeah,
such thing as a white space on a map. If there
yeah,
is, it's because someone doesn't want you looking there.
yeah,
So, like the
absolutely.
absolute absence of any voice of, like these folks held slaves. Like,
Yep. Yeah,
what the heck were they saying about this family and
yeah,
about that house? We only get
absolutely.
to see their horrific treatment, and holy, it was bad.
Yeah, yeah. And then even like it is, and then sort of the contrast of how it is presented, like this horrific treatment as it is presented versus the treatment of the white Bell family, and sort of that's presented like that. But this is the very scary thing. Like let's talk about how they were treated in the presentation by Ingram. And honestly, even a lot of the ways that people talk about this thing, it's absolutely the sort of the contrast in presentation is I think both very like anger inducing and also just very telling. It just feels very, very telling. Yeah, and I think that's sort of like as we sort of proceed, as we go, I think that's one of the most important things for me about how I want to approach making this show, how I want to approach talking to people, the people that I want to approach, it just feels like it just feels very important to me to be thinking about like perspective, right? And if we're talking about the space between, especially when we're in folklore, which is already like blurring the line between fiction and reality. You mentioned the Ingram's a storyteller. It sort of reminded me, I was thinking a lot about one of my favorite strange books is Mothman Prophecies. And thinking about like one of the reasons that is so compelling is just like, John Keel was a good writer. He was good at writing and in ways that like how much of this stuff literally happened, I couldn't possibly tell you. I don't know. He writes well enough that I'm like, I don't know, probably not all of it. Probably not all of it, but however much of it is fascinating to me and just sort of thinking about the sort of the narrative aspect of the paranormal specifically. And I was talking about this a little bit before. I forget who I was talking about with this, but it's really interesting to me. I mentioned that we want to lean documentary over reality TV, and that is absolutely always true. And at the same time, and this is actually very funny. So the deck that I use in the show, the Carnival at the End of the World deck, great deck. I love it a lot. The creators, I reached out to them to be like, "Hey, we're filming the show. I would love to be able to use your deck in it." They were very happy for us to use the show, to use it in the show. But the one of my early draws with this deck, and this deck is very close to my heart because I always use it for paranormal stuff, so it feels very like charged and like the energy in it, like this is our spookiest deck. One of my earliest, most meaningful draws was the Magician, and the Magician in this deck specifically has for a head like a camera, and it's like sort of a lot of it is about movie magic and the idea of like production and the blending of truth and fiction as you go, and so it's really fascinating for me as we think about I'm never going to script anything for this show. I'm going to script a monologue, but I'm not going to script an interaction or whatever. But at the same time, I'll have an interaction. I'll be in the moment. I'll be honest. And our filmmaker will say like, "Hey, this happened in the background. I need you to say that again, or I need you to do another take of that." And so, no matter how genuine, no matter how real you try to be, we're still on camera. We're still setting up lighting. We're still setting up all these things where, like, even if we are not writing fiction, we are never going to be able to present the reality as it just exactly happens because you can't, because you need to get mic'd up and you need to make sure the sun is in a good spot in the sky. You need to make sure all of the lights are there. And so, it's a very interesting thing to me as I can say very confidently, we're not going to stage anything because I don't want to stage anything for this show. But I also can say like we're going to stage the lights, we're going to find the best angle for this shot. We're going to do all of those things. And so you always say you have to it's yet another liminal space where it's like it's real, it's true. These are the things that are happening, but we have to present them in a way to make television. And I just like it's very it's just a very interesting space to be in to sort of to live in for me as I think about the narrative of Ghost Story.
Well, I'm thinking of you referenced Keel, and
Yeah,
we were previously speaking about Ingram. Um,
yeah,
I think that what these folks were doing and what you're doing ostensibly in a different era is you're crafting out a space of wonder,
yeah,
right? And this is what every creator does. They draw from that well of the liminal, and they, what you draw from that well might be a misshapen rock, but you
yeah.
craft it, right? You use your tools and then you sculpt it into what we end up watching. So, for me, after the first 4 minutes, I was like, okay, that's it. who
For
who is
sure.
this Dash and how do I get to know them? Right?
I'm
Which
glad you reached out.
right, which to me is a privilege because, to be in the presence of a storyteller is a gift, right? That's an absolute gift. So I loved every moment of it. And I love talking about folks like Ingram and
Yeah,
Keel and all of these folks who at some point, you could look at Ingram, and he's working with the American Gothic tradition, right?
yeah,
So first sort of etched out by folks like Nathaniel Hawthorne. Yeah, I think Hawthorne,
yeah,
who was really, writing about logic and reason and good and evil. And then, Ingram comes along and says, well, here's a family story. How about I just
yeah,
take everything that Hawthorne did and just turn it up on its head?
yeah,
And as being that white man of his times,
Totally.
you get to see, or you get to if you can read between the lines,
Yeah.
you see how horrific that
Yeah.
whole social stratus was, or stat like
Yeah.
the whole situation was
Yeah.
not good for children, was
Yeah.
not good for the family, and definitely wasn't good for the enslaved population.
Yeah.
Nor was it good for the indigenous peoples whose graves are being
Yeah.
desecrated, or for the
Yeah.
animals who get shot at first
Yeah.
sight.
Absolutely.
What the hell?
Yeah.
No, it's really good to talk about stories, right?
Yeah.
And without, again, as I said, opening that jar and showing the magic that's inside, because once you see it, then it's there, right?
Yeah.
It's said. So when you're there,
Yeah.
and I want to show a clip of this, because I would love
Totally.
it if you could tell us what's going on in this particular scene.
Yeah.
There are other scenes where you're doing this Gansfeld
Yes.
experiment.
Yeah.
So I wanted to show a quick clip of it, and then if you can
Totally.
add some dimension to it.
Totally.
So we go down and we do a couple of things. A couple of us do the Estes. Again, I think it doesn't really pop off until I jump into it.
Or do you want to like hang out with us? Are you like a cool spirit who wants to?
Thinking.
Okay.
I'm thinking. A radio.
Oh yeah, you're using a radio frequency right now. So
Down. We're talking about across. Great.
are you something that's out here in the woods with us?
Feel the one below. It's supposed to come.
Where are you right now?
It's handy.
It's Andy? Damn, Andy, the Bell Witch all along.
I knew it. I never asked.
A lot of people are saying
It's threatening.
Oh, okay. Maybe we should turn that. All right.
So I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I
Yeah.
want to hear from you. What was happening there?
So this was our I think third Estes session of the investigation. This was the first two we had done on night one at the museum and then the theater space. And so this was our Estes session that we did at the Kings Bluff Cliffs. And it's not always the case that I'm the one who sort of it really comes through with. A lot of times it does come through like really, really strong with Rosa. In our bonus episode, there's a lot of stuff that comes through when Rosa's plugged in that was like really interesting and really sort of like meaningful to me. But in Tennessee, for whatever reason, I was sort of the only person who, when we would plug into the SS, like it would get really responsive. And so this one we had hiked down. I think Rosa rolled her ankle. It was like a really sort of treacherous hike down. It was not ideal. And so I think we were all a little bit tense there. And when I plugged in though, it started talking about the one below really stood out to me. Like feel the one below. That was really fascinating to me on a couple of levels, especially sort of as we think about sort of like, Christian mythology, as we think about like, what do we think about as below, like, as above, so below, as we think about like sort of the iconography of below. But I was also thinking about the one below in the museum the night before. The museum space was downstairs and the theater space was upstairs. And so there's an argument that the one below is the whatever entity I was sort of engaging with in that downstairs space too, which was sort of, again, felt very negative, felt very heavy, felt very sort of oppressive. And so this idea of feel the one below and it's supposed to come was very, very interesting to me. It was very interesting to me having had that sort of, I guess, genuinely frightening experience the night before. And then specifically the part where I think it said it's threatening, which I think Rosa took as being threatened in the moment. But it's threatening word-wise is not necessarily a threat, right? It's not saying I am threatening or anything like that. It's threatening as sort of we're one removed from like, who is it threatening? What is being threatened? And so that Estes session particularly, I think there are a lot of sometimes this happens where there I would say the rarest session I leave it and I'm like I have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about and what's going on. Most of them I'm like that was weird and also I do not know how to parse it even now. And so that was another one of those where I just there were a few moments out in nature that just felt like we were being presented with like a lot of information and a lot of things and a lot of sort of like threads to pull on without necessarily knowing where we are being taken, where we are being led to, or sort of drawn into, if that makes sense.
It does as an endpoint, but I wonder
Yeah.
if as a starting point, you're wearing a
Yes.
visor,
Yeah.
and you're using the word Estes. So like,
Totally.
tell us about the method, like
Definitely.
what you're doing.
So the Estes method was pioneered by Carl Pfeiffer and Connor Randall as part of a web series called The Spirits of Stanley. The Spirits of Stanley was a web series about the Stanley Hotel. Carl and Connor were part of the in-house ghost hunting team for the Stanley Hotel. The Stanley Hotel, a lot of people will know as the inspiration for the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. Like that is the hotel that the Overlook was based off of. The Stanley is in Estes Park, Colorado, and so the Estes method is named after the geographic location. Um, it uses a spirit box, which is a device that it's a really simple device. It just clicks through radio frequencies. And so you can set it to AM, you can set it to FM, you can change the speed of it. These are things that often people do not explain in ghost shows. They just start doing them. And I love first of all, and I will say allow me to soapbox for a moment. I get so grumpy when people just start doing a thing, especially in anything, because the Estes is relatively new. It was pioneered not very long ago. Spirits of Stanley, I don't remember the year it was made, but it's a fairly contemporary show where they invented this methodology. And then people started using the Estes method in Hellier. Hellier became very popular. And I'll say it, Connor and Carl are in Hellier, so like they can do it. They can use their own method in the show. But I started seeing as soon as Hellier got popular, I started seeing other ghost shows just start doing the Estes method. And they're calling it the Estes method. They're calling it all sorts of stuff. But nobody is like, hey, we got this from these guys. And so it was very important to me, and maybe this is the English major in me, but like cite your sources. Like you could say, I love to use tarot in investigation. I had no idea that this practice was pioneered by my friend Katie Webb, egregore organized on all social media. She really started like the whole like let's bring a tarot deck and like tarot in paranormal investigation. That's another one that I see people do all over the place, and I've not seen a single person say like, "Hey, Katie Webb started doing this," and that's worth mentioning. So we mentioned that in our bonus episode. We do it in the pilot. I did not know in the pilot. In our bonus episode, I got to explain that to Ray Wise, which I told Katie, I was like, hey, here's a clip of me explaining your part in history to Ray Wise from Twin Peaks. And so she was very excited about that. But I think citing your source is very important. Sorry, that's my rant about I wish people would talk about where they get the methodology from, because it's interesting and I want to know and I want to see how it was done originally.
And same here.
Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah.
Another term you use, Gansfeld.
Yes, so that is a different experiment. So I'll finish with the Estes. The Estes is the spirit box clicks through radio frequencies, and so you'll hear little snippets of words. And so a lot of people will use it in a group setting, like they'll just put it on and turn the volume on. And so the snippets of words are little snippets of radio hosts and songs and things like that as it clicks through. And the idea is whatever you are hearing is being sort of guided by circumstance to sort of produce answers to the questions you're asking. And the issue in general is that, whatever the effect, I think it's called pareidolia or pareidola, I forget. Our brains finding information where maybe there are patterns where there isn't necessarily a pattern. And so if you ask a question yourself and you hear a box spitting out a bunch of little sounds, your brain is going to want to hear the answer to the question you asked. And so the Estes method seeks to move around that by plugging one person into the spirit box. So they have a set of isolation headphones. It's very important. I use the headphones that like drummers use for this. Isolation headphones and a blindfold to sort of be in a sensory deprivation state. And one person can only hear the spirit box and they can't hear the questions that other people are asking, and the other people can't hear the spirit box, they can only ask questions. And so the people asking questions ask their questions, and the person plugged into the spirit box just sort of parrots back whatever they're hearing from the box itself. Now what I've found as I've done this is that the rhythmic clicking of the thing really helps you get into what sort of feels like a little bit of a trance state. And I do think that is part of what sort of makes it feel sort of magical and interesting and cool, is sort of like being lulled into a trance state by the spirit box. That's one of the things I like enjoy about the practice. I will say you can use it to talk to anything. You can use it. You don't have to be, it's not limited just to ghosts or spirits. We wanted to celebrate, not so we wanted to participate in Big Night. I don't know if you're aware of Big Night. Big Night, the some of the first warm, rainy days of the year. Amphibians will be moved from the places they live to their vernal pools to lay eggs. And so this is called Big Night. And if you go out during Big Night, you have a decent chance of seeing whatever really cool amphibians live around your sort of location. And some places like you can do it, like you can actually go help them because they have to cross roads. And so some people just go out and like stop traffic and be like, there's a bunch of spotted salamanders. Please don't drive your car over them and stuff like that. So it's a really cool sort of thing, like citizen science thing you can do. But we were trying to figure out where to go and when to go do it. And we were like, why don't we do an Estes method in the yard and try to talk to just like sort of the abstract concept of salamanders? And so we did. And we asked like the day to go and when to do it and how to do it. And it told us, we gave it the binary choice. So like we were either going to Wednesday or Friday. We were told pretty consistently, like, I think it was like second one is the thing that came out. So like, all right, Friday it is. And we went out, and for the first time in our lives, we saw some spotted salamanders, and it was very, very exciting. It was a very cool experience. So you can use it to sort of communicate with anything, and I think you can have a cool and sort of interesting time doing it. The Gansfeld experiment is a different one. This started, I think it was created with the idea of being like a self-hypnosis thing. And so similarly, it's traditionally done with ping pong balls and like a red light, and you shine red light into the ping pong balls over your eyes, and you use that to sort of induce like a self hypnosis. And I think a lot of people listen to like a static or just like some sort of gray or white noise with it. I made a little visor. I took some swim goggles and I sprayed over the eye part with like glass frosting, and then I put a string of like LED lights over it to do red, because I was like, I don't like taping ping pong balls to my face, and it's just like the having to put it on and tape it on each time. I was like, I would rather just like have a thing that I could do. So I created a little like goggle. I sprayed the goggles and I put a little visor. In the show, we put Fox in the Gansfeld experiment, and she sees a lot of stuff about. I wanted to have Fox do it because, like, as an intuitive witch, she I think is like a little more practiced. I think, sort of like taking those feelings and sort of experiencing that I guess version of magic practice. I am learning. I'm trying to be more conscious about the magic. I've said for a long time that like magic just sort of happens at me, and I've been trying in the last couple months to be like really conscious about like, can I access this? Can I do this on purpose? How much can I participate? And it's been cool and interesting. But I was like, I would like to see what Fox sort of sees from it. And she saw a lot of stuff about, I think, like deer running. She saw a lot about like a family and this idea of like pregnancy, sort of like secret pregnancy, all stuff that I have sort of heard with regard to like theories about what was happening with Betsy Bell, theories about what was happening, sort of some of the stuff that could have created some of the trauma that sort of interacted with. There's a running theory that Betsy's sort of had been experiencing some form of abuse from John, and it is that sort of like that abuse that creates a tulpa of that creates the entity of the Bell Witch. I definitely think I think that is a very interesting theory. It makes a lot of sense. My own sort of theory, I do think that the entity was more sort of nature based, like based in sort of the natural world and sort of there, but I would never be like, that one's wrong and this one's right, because I don't think there is a way that I could know. And I find both theories really fascinating, to be honest. But yeah, so those are sort of the two main methodologies we used out there on the Kings Bluff Cliffs. We use the Estes a lot just because I feel like it's a really like good jumping in point for whatever the investigation is going to be.
Wow. Uh, so when I think of what I watched in
Yeah.
episode one, it goes back to, well, first it goes to that notion of paranormal investigators, by and large, go to draw material
Yeah.
evidence from an entirely ineffable
Yeah.
experience, something that's highly subjective and something that is for the person and for the people. But you can't you can't mark it down and say this is what it was, because it's a
Yeah.
living experience that each of
Yeah.
us has if we're so open to it. But I was also thinking this was an occasion in which I am actually watching or witnessing the lineage of the spiritualist movement
Yeah.
come around to this media. And I say that because uh, early seances, for instance, and I'm these are two separate things,
Totally.
but early seances and even seances now, with either a physical medium or otherwise, uh, re often involves sensory deprivation.
Yeah.
And it does so. And again, I'm not going into whether it's, true or false or fact or
Totally.
fiction. It does so with the sole intent of communicating with the spirit realm. And early attempts within the spiritualist church, or the spiritualist movement, sort of mirror what we see with the paranormal community now, with
Yeah.
the Cottingley fairies, or
Yeah.
photographic evidence of whatever's happening. Um, but I think if we step away from that desire to know and to prove, what you were doing, in my mind at least, and I could be
Yeah.
wrong, is you were expressing the lineage of the spiritualist movement that seeks to communicate with the other side, with spirits. And to me, that's a gem. I really appreciate
Yeah.
that.
No, totally. I don't think I had thought about it that way. And I that actually like brings me a lot of joy. I don't know if you can tell from me smiling, but that's yeah, no, that feels right. That feels right to me. And that's very cool actually.
Yeah, I think it's it's a tradition that itself was formed as a response to colonization and
Yeah.
industrialism, the destruction of the earth, right? This
Yeah,
this
totally.
notion that, if we can uh, focus, or maybe not focus, but shift our attention away from things and away
Yeah.
from comfort, and actually be closer to the world will speak back
Yeah.
at its core.
Yeah. And I think, as I think about like I said this, I forget who I was talking to. The even like like the ancient Greeks and the way that they used to think about, you know, every stream is its own little god. Every large sort of every forest, every sort of existing part of nature has, and I guess we're getting sort of into animism stuff, but this idea that like things have personalities and can talk to you. One of the first times I went out and I did paranormal stuff, when I was sort of like testing, like, how does this feel? Like, is this something that I am even going to enjoy doing? We went out to a place called Fort Wetherill out here. I had sort of followed a string of synchronicities that I had been having around death omens. For a long time, I was sort of, there's a Korean superstition that the number 4 is bad. It's an unlucky number. Because the word for 4 sounds a lot like our word for death. And so, in a Korean hotel, you will not find a 4th floor in the same way that in an American hotel, you won't find a 13th floor. And so I had a point where I was just like, hi, don't want to dodge this number anymore. Feels very silly. And also, like, death is cool and interesting. And at some point it will happen. And I'm not rushing towards it. I'll do my best to not engage in it for as long as I can, but also it is a part of life and I don't want to be afraid of it any longer. And I started to really embrace the number four. And right around that time, I was looking for like a place to go try some paranormal stuff. And this place, Fort Wetherill, which is a abandoned military base that has sort of been overtaken by nature. I was reading the description of it, and it was like, one of the main apparitions that people see here is a black dog, which is the death omen. This idea of like the big black dog is the death omen. And I was like, all right, death omen, that's a spot, that's where we're going for sure. And so we went out there, and we just tried to do some of the Estes stuff. We tried to do some of the things, and what really it felt like we were connecting with was just sort of nature and the natural world around us. It felt like there were moments where it felt like this just kind of feels like the general concept of birds. It just feel like the abstraction of birds is what it felt like we were talking to. Or some of the stuff just felt like this is sort of like the vines that are overtaking this, like the concrete bases and all these things. And I think that was, for me, it was just a moment of like, oh yeah, like this is just like, you can just talk to anything. Like you can reach out and you can talk to the natural world and you can hear the natural world, and the natural world can like talk to you and just sort of like express to you whatever sort of is going on. And I think that just both felt really special, and to me felt like, okay, this is going to sort of color how I engage with this sort of just in general for the long haul.
I love that. And the way you're speaking, if I can use a visual metaphor, it's like, I don't know, perhaps you're a musician and you have all of these strings just hanging, and
Totally.
nobody taught us how to be a musician, so every
Yeah.
chord we strike is a missed note. So there's
Yeah.
something wrong with the strings. There's something wrong with the world. There's something wrong with the guitar.
Yeah.
But no, actually, if you slow down, you
Yeah.
stop, and perhaps you shift what you're thinking these strings are,
Yeah.
then you'll start to hear music.
Yeah.
And so not just hearing music, though, I guess I'm using strings because I often use strings when I think of synchronicities,
Yeah.
which is something that is very apparent in your
Yeah.
episode, how synchronicities resonate with you. So not only are we dealing with strings, but perhaps we're dealing with strings that seem to have no connection but are suddenly braided,
Yeah.
right?
I have been calling it the red thread of fate, which I think I got from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But yeah, I think of it as sort of like a string that sort of ties
Yeah.
a lot of things together.
And in your episode, so again, I survived the first 4 minutes and was,
Okay, yeah,
I after I cooled down and reached out to you, and I was like, it's taking me a while to watch this episode, because it really
Yeah.
was like I could only
Totally.
process so much of it. So
Totally.
I started having synchronicities, and some of them
Yeah.
were kind of frightening. So before we get to, I want to talk about a funny synchronicity that I had.
Yeah.
And I thought you got a kick out of it too. That synchronicity in particular that I want to talk about in a bit has as actually a deeper anchor to it. So
Okay.
there's the it's an absolute binary. So this
Yeah.
really whimsical part, and then this much deeper thread. Again,
Yeah.
strings. Can you tell us about the jar?
So we our second investigation day is when we started really interviewing, like the premise of the show being, during the daytime we're going to talk to cool local queer and trans magic practitioners. And so, the first day we talked to Tim, who is a town historian. But that was, I'm not to assume anything about Tim. Tim was not in the here the queer people we're talking to portion of the show. I don't know, I do not know Tim's orientation. I will not guess as to such. But for the first interview, our first interview of the day was a person named Jael, and Jael was a little bit late to the interview, and that was fine. And I found out later that he was late because he was bringing a jar with a zinnia from his garden that he grew. And so I go out to meet him in the parking lot, and he's just like, "Hey, this is for you. I wanted to gift you this flower in this jar." And I took it. And I was like, "Very sweet. It's nice." You can kind of see it when I'm sitting on a table interviewing. You can kind of see it behind me in a couple of the shots. But I was gifted this jar. I'm looking at it right now. I have a little altar table. It's right there, and I was gifted this jar with this flower, and I didn't think too much about it. And the second interview location for us was Aroma G Botanica, and I love a Botanica. It's a fun, I love picking up the little oils and ointments for candle magic. And so a thing about Rosa, and this backstory didn't necessarily make it all the way into the show, but Rosa has psychic dreams. Rosa has premonitory dreams. Only ever mundane ones, though. The only time Rosa gets a picture of the future is like a very specific, very mundane experience where like it'll be someone saying, "Do you have a red pencil?" and someone saying, "I do not have a red pencil." And then she'll wake up and be like, "The fuck was that?" And so and then like 2 weeks later it'll happen in real life. And so I always tease Rosa. I'm always like, "You have the world's most useless psychic ability. Like if this is nothing. Like what do you could future dreams could win you the lottery, but this one is this is nothing. This is the nothing, like, and I'm always like, you should be training it. I'm just joking around though. And so we're at this Botanica, and Rosa is like, all right, I do have this useless ability. Let me try to make it better. And so she purchases ointment that you apply to, your third eye, the center of your forehead, in an attempt to better understand information from dreams, to better understand the secret information that you're supposed to be given through dreams. And so Rosa kind of has this like, haha, I will train it up. I'm going to get this ointment. And she shows that to me, and I'm like, funny. It's a funny thing. Rose and I have a very sibling relationship. We joke about being platonic twin flames. That's sort of, we've been making that joke for a long time. I did not know about the weird culture on twin flames. We've been making the joke less, I will say that. But there's a lot of wild things. We are both from the San Francisco Bay Area. We did not meet until we had both moved to New York for comedy. We did not know that we had lived in the same apartment complex at the same time as children. We were two kids in the same, like, there's a lot of, we had the same hangover Denny's. There's a lot of little moments of connection between the two of us. So, we tease each other a lot. And so we get to the final interview segment of the show. It's our last interview. And the person, Oluwatobi, they had asked us if they could do a tarot read for us in the pre-production, like when we were talking. And I was like, yeah, that would be great. I actually really love that. And so when we get there, they were like, I actually just started learning to use this Oracle deck. Can I use this Oracle deck for you? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds great. I don't really have any experience with Oracle decks, so I would love to see how that works. And Rosa asks the question, like, are we on the right path? Are we pursuing this the right way? And Rosa draws, and the card is just talking about, like, I think it's called the Wild Winds, and it's about like information that's supposed to be given to you. And then it says pay attention to, and then Oluwatobi sort of stumbles over the word and is like sing, and both me and Rosa, you can see us be like synchronicities, because I have this whole thing where like I've had a lot of synchronicities in the lead up to the show. I've had a lot of synchronicities with other paranormal media, and in fact I had told the filmmaker Andy, who we were working with at the time, I'd be like, hey, I have this whole explainer for synchronicities that I would like to shoot, just to sort of talk about it and explain what it is. And then we both forgot to schedule it. Like I was planning, and then, but at that point it was kind of too late. And so now though, we have teed up like, hey, one of our guests is like, would you explain synchronicities? Which is like so funny because it's like, oh my God, like that was like literally I forgot to schedule something and it's being scheduled for me by circumstance. And so I explain it, and that feels weird and that feels wild. And we're like, all right, that's really cool. And then Toby is like, oh, there's also a spell on this card. Do you want the spell? And the spell, you go out in the woods with a jar and you capture the wind, and then you put the jar by your pillow and it gives you secret messages in your dreams. And so now we've got this jar that I was literally handed that morning, and Rosa has this dream ointment for decoding messages from dreams. And now we've got this spell and the pieces for it and all the tools. And I feel like I'm playing Legend of Zelda, where it's like, grab this item and bring it to this space, and then you'll be able to do this move. And I'm like, that's wild. Like that is, and this is the thing where as soon as it happened, I was like, people aren't going to believe that this happened. Like this is going to be the thing where people are like, that's, come on, like you scripted that, you wrote that out. And it was this moment where I was like, okay, like now I feel like we're on to something. Now I feel like we're on this path. Like, you go out there and spooky things happen, but it's like it hadn't felt, I mean, nothing had really sort of clicked. And my thing that I have sort of come to in all of this is that in the theater space that we were investigating, we were dealing with something that I had started calling gay director ghost. And I don't think that was a ghost so much as I have for a number of years been sort of like developing sort of playfully tongue-in-cheek relationship with sort of Dionysus and the sort of the god of trans people, god of performance and revelry and sort of all these things. And as I was thinking about this idea that we were in the theater, which is a really Dionysian space, we're in the theater and we are sort of it felt playful, and I was like, okay, it sort of felt like I felt like we were assisted in scripting by divinity. It really felt like, hey, you all don't really have a narrative necessarily, let me set that up for you. And just, yeah, that is what I came to, and that is probably the wildest thing. I mean, the jar is like, it feels like a very like a magical. It feels like, I don't know. I do not ever plan on parting with this jar. I've got it on my altar. It still has the flower, and the flower is dry by now, obviously. But yeah. So that was just a real magical fetch quest in just sort of the silliest possible way, and a very fun, meaningful, like just a little. It just felt like yeah, you are doing something interesting at the very least right now.
Well, I can assure you that it wasn't scripted, or if it was, I was somehow written in, and in the strangest, but also most banal and funny
Yeah,
ways.
yeah,
So when I was watching the video before I even got to the jar, I was on Facebook, and I joined a group on Facebook that's called "Bitch, I'm a Witch."
yeah,
And there was a meme that showed up, and I'm just going to share the screen
yeah. Of
because
course.
this meme appeared, and then I watched
Yeah.
that section with the jar, and it's entirely relevant
Yeah.
right here. So it says, "I heard you should not buy your tarot decks. Is this true?" And
Yeah.
and the response is, "I heard you must acquire tarot decks by farting in a glass jar and throwing it into the ocean. If the jar comes back with the deck, you're meant to have it. If it comes back with an extra fart, that means Jesus found it and doesn't appreciate your effort to take part in the devil's Uno."
Yeah.
Oh, when I think of synchronicities,
Yeah.
I'm also thinking, some of them are damn funny,
I think most of them are. I say this a lot,
right?
but humor to me is so grounding. Humor is such a like. Someone asked me how I avoid floating off into space, as how I avoid becoming every license plate is an angel number, every bird is a message from a specific deity type person. And I think my answer is humor, and humor sort of is grounding, and the fact that the phenomenon is so funny so
Yeah.
often. But even, even there's a moment in the pilot where I'm having this first Estes session in the museum, and I'm feeling very bad physically because
Mhm.
whatever I'm engaging with feels very overbearing and sort of oppressive and bad. And then I say the teeth. I say the teeth and I laugh. And the laugh sort of brings me out of it. It brings me out of this bad feeling. And it's sort of like it's a reset. And I'm able to sort of be okay. And sort of I think about the times where laughter has sort of saved me. And
Mm.
everyone who does stand-up comedy is usually, not everyone, most people doing stand-up comedy are dealing with some sort of trauma, and that's why we get up on stage and beg to be beg for strangers to think that we are clever. And humor has been such a sort of an integral part of my life for so long. And so the teeth moment obviously sort of called back to the moment with Tim, the town historian, where he asked if we wanted to see the false teeth, and I say no, and he says, he's like, oh, a different person was back here, and he wanted me to get the teeth out, and so jokingly I'm like, oh, he's a real pervert then, huh? Because that's funny to me. And Tim is like, well, no, he's not a pervert, he's writing a book. And I was like, for sure. Yeah, it's just a little joke, but that's fine. Because the idea of a teeth pervert is very funny to me. And so this like very specific moment being sort of called to in the Estes was very much
Mm.
like, hey, it's okay, it's good, like you can laugh, like you're fine, like you are okay in
Absolutely.
this moment. And so yeah, when I think of synchronicity, it is to me almost always like at least a little bit funny.
Hmm. Well, absolutely. Now, I was almost laughing at myself before
Okay.
we began, and I shared this with you before we started recording,
Yeah.
because like everything was going wrong. I didn't have my cord for my computer. I had to go home to get it.
Yeah.
I wanted to queue up more clips to show, but that's fine. It is what it is. Put a pen
Totally.
down here, it'd appear over there. Although it wasn't a red pen, it was a blue pen.
Okay.
Um, and then just like the second that you joined, I remembered my absolute favorite poem.
Okay.
Are you familiar with Wallace Stevens?
Yes.
Okay, he's my favorite poet.
Cool.
And so going back to when I wrote my master's, I actually started my master's thesis with this poem. And I'm going to share it with you if you don't
Okay.
mind.
Please.
So it's Anecdote of the Jar.
Okay.
I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's pretty cool, I think. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool, I think. Damn. Okay, yeah. That's
Right?
great. That's really cool. That's
Right?
really cool. Yeah.
And so some of the background to that story, that
Yeah.
poem, and
Yeah.
the poem plays with binaries too, but also
Yeah.
of a port in air
Yeah.
is sort of a play of an important air. But
Yeah.
he was walking around in Tennessee and came across this Dominion glass jar
Yeah.
on a hill, right?
Yeah. That's spectacular.
So like
Yeah.
just as we're beginning, like
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, I know what's missing. Like, forget all this other stuff. It's my absolute favorite poem by Wallace
Yeah.
Stevens.
That's incredible. Even the even the part at the end. What was the part? There's a part I'm just gonna pull up the words on my side. Um Anecdote of a Jar, it's called.
Yes, anecdote of the jar.
There's a part with biblical imagery.
It did not give of bird or bush.
Bird or bush. Yeah. So what's interesting about the what's interesting to me about bird or bush is bush specifically when I'm thinking, I don't know why that just sort of felt like burning
Mhm.
bush, sort of a bird. I think maybe it's the sort of the auditory similar of bird and
Yeah.
burning. Um, in the sort of like the field, the one below, and thinking about sort of like biblical and the sort of the biblical themes, but specifically also like when we think about the idea of witchcraft and the devil and all these things and sort of how it did not give of bird or bush, it doesn't sort of resonate necessarily with sort of the biblical presentation. That feels to me very like of the thesis as we're going for like, no, we're not, this is not like devil stuff. It's just like it's magic. But specifically to the person that we're doing episode two with is Mortellus, who is so episode two, with episode one we started in the past, and so episode two, our plan, we're going to North Carolina to sort of really do a profile of my friend Mortellus, who is one of the most interesting weirdos that I know. They are a coven leader of Gardnerian Wiccans. They do necromancy and spirit work and death work, like day job death work and also magic death work. They make spirit boards out of coffin wood. They're just a really fascinating, interesting person, and their whole iconography is a black bird. So it's a sort of like a bird is specifically like what they sort of present themselves with and as. And one of the reasons that we're going there's two reasons. One is that when Rosa is recounting her dream from the oil in the ointment, she saw a flock of birds. She saw birds in that dream. And so she talks about that. So specifically, what the jar synchronicity, what the magic spell brought to Rosa was the imagery of birds. Specifically, I think they were grackles. If I recall, Rosa's pretty good on bird ID, and Rosa was like, I think they were grackles. Two, and this is the like one of the spookier. I'll talk about it. I I've been haunted by a name for nearly 10 years. I've been haunted by a name for nearly 10 years, and that name is Robert Graves. And I've been getting phone calls. I've been getting wrong number phone calls from Bay Area phone numbers asking for Robert Graves. Is this Robert Graves? Asking for Robert Graves. And I just thought, oh, there's like some guy with a phone number close to mine. Totally. I didn't think about it. I was like, this is just kind of annoying. Um, we finished filming the episode, and I am talking to Mortellus about it because I'm already kind of like I really want to spend an episode with Mortellus. I don't know when exactly, and I'm talking about how I'm like I think it was like I kind of feel it was a Dionysus guiding us, which feels wild. And they're like, "Oh, you got to check out this comic book," and so they recommended me this comic book, and I pick it up, and it's about gods and stuff. And in the second trade paperback, a character says like I was the one who inspired the white god. I was the white goddess. I was the one who inspired Robert Graves, and I'm like. Hmm. And so, I mean, I put the book down. I go on my computer and I message Mortellus. I'm like, hey, do you know who Robert Graves is? And they're like, I wouldn't be much of a neo-pagan if I didn't. And so I start looking it up and I start Googling. And Robert Graves wrote this poem called The White Goddess that was like a foundational text of Gardnerian Wicca. And so Robert Graves is this person who lived, when that was being founded and wrote this poem and like is an integral part of magic stuff. And I'm like, all right, well, this is very strange now because I've been getting these fucking phone calls for so long that are asking, is this Robert Graves? Is Robert Graves there? Do you want to sell your property? Is often what it comes with. Like, do you want to buy? So, like, hey, Robert Graves, do you want to sell your property? And so I am like, okay, this feels very spooky. This feels very spooky and weird. A little bit after that, I have this phone call with Andy, who's the cinematographer who shot the first episode for us. And he's like, "Oh yeah, I've been having this synchronicity lately." And I'm like, "Oh, please tell me about it." And he's like, "People keep talking about this." And he mentions a indigenous folklore sort of being whose name you're not supposed to say out loud. And I'm like, "Oh, don't say that." And he's like, oh, but that's what keeps happening. He's like, people keep saying that. And I ask, what does that mean? And someone is like, don't talk about it. And I was like, well, Google's free, but also like, I fill him in on some of it. And I say, there is a ranch named after this being. And I say it's in Nevada, and I'm wrong because it's in Utah. But I say there's this ranch. I get off the phone. And 1 hour later, I get a phone call from a Utah area code. And I pick up the phone and it's like, you're in tax trouble, which is the easiest way to scare me very much, is to tell me I am in tax trouble. Um, because that's scary, right? The IRS is scary. It's a scary organization. And I'm like, whoa, like, what did I do? How can I fix it? And the person on the phone is like, well, we just need to talk to you about your property in Utah. And I was like, well, I don't own property in Utah. And they're like, is this not Robert Graves? So the first ever Robert Graves call that I get that is not from a Bay Area phone number is from a Utah phone number. 1 hour after I explain this being. And I'm just sitting there like, well, I guess I can't ever go to Utah. Like I guess I cannot go to Utah because it feels ominous. I
What a
I
trip.
a real trip, and also just like I feel neither the cultural competency nor anything to be like, oh, let's investigate. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't think so, actually. But all of that sort of coming through a recommendation for a comic book that Mortellus had made. For me, it was very much like, oh yeah, we gotta go spend episode 2 with Mortellus. Like that's zero question. Like that's the bird sign through the dream and all this. And now, especially from this poem, like the bird being like right there, it just feels that's great. Thank you for sharing that with me. That is
Yeah,
spectacular.
no problem. But right, this is the music of
Yeah,
synchronicity.
yeah,
And I think it's not like a song that is definitive, but it's something
yeah,
that is continually being added to. And perhaps when you're on that right path, you're hearing the right notes,
yeah.
right?
Which
And
again feels very video games to me in a really fun way. In a really fun way. That's like it's games, it's play, it's playful in a way that just is really, really spectacular to me.
yeah, and what fun would it be if the world and nature ended at our fingertips,
Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah.
And I think having an awareness and being open to those threads, and when those chords are being strummed, that's a part of us that is involved with that. So perhaps we don't end at ourselves, but there's more deeper connections.
One of the things that I've sort of as I think about, like the land back movement, as I sort of get more involved in sort of, I do a lot of Palestine advocacy and like organizing for Palestine here where I live. And I also, I try to attend events by UAINE, which is an indigenous organization out here. They run the National Day of Mourning, which is instead of going and celebrating American Genocide Day with people in November, I will my partner and I will drive down to Plymouth, and like there's it's a really beautiful action that a lot of indigenous organizations put on, and there's a lot of cool like Palestine solidarity there. But one of the things that I've heard so much as I've listened to speakers, speaking at these actions, at these events, is this idea that like one, obviously like colonization and colonialism and imperialism are all very evil. And one way that it's very tragic, even for the people who are living sort of, who aren't, who are, citizens of empire, is that this divide between us and the natural world, instead of considering us as we are all part of the natural world, like we are animals just like anything else. We exist as part, and this sort of this divide of like, no, like city, where the city ends the nature begins, is this sort of like this weird, it's another binary, right, that sort of does not serve us, and in fact really harms us in terms of how we exist. And I think about that a lot in terms of the way that I was raised, and sort of like I used to be very like I did not like bugs. I was like not a bug person. And my partner loves bugs and has been like brought a lot of enjoyment to insects and bugs and creatures to my life. And I'm like, oh yeah, these are actually really cool. These are really cool little things that we get to share a planet. I spent a lot of today in the woods just marveling at a weevil. I love weevils. They're so cute and silly looking. Um, but we're part of this. We're part of the natural world. And I think it is one of the real evils of sort of the sort of like this colonial imperial thing to be like, no, we are separate from that. We are, this idea of like quote unquote civilized, right? This sort of this very loaded, very like white supremacist word basically that like keeps us from being a part of nature. And I think like we are part of the natural world as much as we, even if we try very hard not to be. And so I don't know. I just that feels, yeah, very very
Yeah, it's
relevant.
definitely appropriate. And to bring it back to John Bell, first thing he does when he
Yeah,
sees a magical creature is he shoots
shoots
it.
at it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I appreciate the time and the energy and the level of discussion that we have had, Dash, because it has filled me up.
I'm
My
so
jar is
glad.
filled up
Likewise.
because of this.
I this has been a delight. I've you reached out to me on Facebook and I was just like, yeah, for sure. Let's do the podcast. Let's talk. But then you kept talking to me and I was like, oh no, this is a cool person. Like, this is a cool person with cool stuff to say. Like that rocks.
Yeah, and
What
I
up?
owe you some things too. I remember I was just going back through. I'm like, oh yeah, there's this paper that I wrote that I was going to send
Yeah, yeah,
Dash, but
yeah.
I forgot. So I'll send that
I
your
def
way.
I would be very interested
Again,
in reading.
these synchronicity threads, they're still being woven. So
Oh yeah.
I look forward to watching episode 2 and the bonus episode.
I
Uh,
definitely let me know after you watch the bonus episode. I'm very proud of that, and it's also just Ray Wise, a real delight of a man, very fun to work with, and just kind of
oh,
like
great.
a very sweet weirdo.
Okay, so I'm going to post links to all of these things as well, and I wish you all the best, and I'm so looking forward to episode 2.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to get out there and shoot it, and I also have this sneaking suspicion we're gonna keep talking on Facebook about all the cool weird stuff we think. So.
Yeah. Well, thanks again.